I would like to start my presentation with a simple question to you, my audience, whether you have ever worked with the SSR before. My guess is that many of you may have not worked with the SSR because it's kind of not popular technology, especially in the Angular framework. Therefore, today we are going to discuss the current state of the Angular SSR, how we are doing, what are the new features, and what may be potential challenges when working with this technology in your applications. I am David. I've been programming for around 8 years so far, and since 2 years, I have a pleasure to be a part of a project that utilizes Angular SSR on the production environment for around 2 years. My favorite JavaScript topics are for sure the bundle size and tree shaking. They are really useful in case of the SSR and whole performance optimizations. Besides that, I am also an Angular.love blogger and developer at House of Angular, and that's pretty much it. So let's start this presentation with a very simple question, whether your application does actually need an SSR. And I would say that your applications often don't need SSR. SSR is useful everywhere where your potential customers and people that will be using your application don't know your product yet. So for example, let's say an SSR is an ideal choice for applications like blogs, e-commerce, or some small photo galleries. Thanks to the biggest advantage of the SSR ability to provide SEO per individual page, I think this is a really great choice for any applications of this kind. Another great thing that is here in the SSR is the quick initial load that will allow us to make sure that our users won't bounce out very early when they are opening our application just because they have a slow internet connection. So with that in mind, let's take a look what actually SSR offers currently in the Angular. And oh boy, I would say it offers a lot. There has been many developer previews so far and even more stable changes. As of right now in the version 19, we've got many stable features. One of them is hydration, which was a complete game changer in case of the SSR. Then we also received an event replay, which allowed us with both hydration to create incremental hydration. Another great thing that we hadn't back in the days of Angular 12 was pre-rendering. And I think it is a really great feature, which, for example, we utilize in our blog Angular.love. And without it, I would say creating such application, especially with the static content that don't need to be rendered every time the request is made, I think pre-rendering is really good. And last stable feature, but not least, is that Angular material components completely support hydration since the version 18, which was not so obvious. For the things that are currently in the developer preview, I would say that there are also many exciting things. For example, the incremental hydration. Then we have support for translations from the Angular localized library. And this was a really huge change that many projects have been waiting for. Fortunately, we've got it in the Angular 19 as the developer preview. Another thing that I am excited about in case of the SSR is the RxJS operator pending until event, which blocks the stabilization of the SSR applications and allow us to fully create SSR applications that are zoneless. And last but not least feature is the hybrid rendering. And I would say that it is completely game changer for the SSR. And the SSR will look even brighter in the future, in my opinion, because we may expect a lot of new features. One thing is sure, that the Angular team tries to build a solution that will work on any JavaScript runtime. So we may also expect support for the Deno and Ban. Another thing that they will be experimenting with is the support for the Nitro.js tool that will allow us to streamline the deploy process of the SSR applications. And also, last thing that I would like to cover in this section is the improved performance. I've been following SSR for around 2 years, and every few months I see a new PR that boosts up the performance of the SSR by around 2, 3, and sometimes even 5%. that's accumulating, and Angular SSR is becoming faster with each day, which in my opinion is really good because I can already see it that my application is simply running faster. But that doesn't mean that SSR is fully complete yet. In my opinion, one thing that we are missing as of right now, which for example is available in the next, is ability to create our projects utilizing Angular SSR from starters. In case of the Next.js, we can create a project based on the blog template, e-commerce template, photo gallery template, or even small things like Stripe integration. This allows us to adjust our projects accordingly, and it's especially useful in case we are working on a smaller projects, which in my opinion, SSR is especially good at. So with that keeping in mind, let's go to the another section and let's check out potential drawbacks and challenges that we may experience when working with the SSR in our applications. I would like to start with the tip of the iceberg and come into the abyss. That means we'll start with the easiest and most common problems in the SSR and finish at these that are most complex. So I'm pretty sure the one thing that every one of you know when it comes to the SSR is that in case of the SSR, we are lacking the browser's API at the server side. There are many ways to don't access the window object, session storage, local storage at the server side. And in my opinion, the most effective way as of doing this right now is using the after next render hook, which only executes the code on the client side. The legacy approach was by using the is-platform browser or is-platform server functionality, depending on our environment. And last approach, which is one of my favorite for things like local storage and session storage, is creating services with different implementation for the SSR and local storage, so we don't have to even use the after next render hook. This is a really great thing. Another thing that you may experience when working with SSR is for sure the developer experience. You will quickly find that there are not that many applications that utilize Angular SSR, especially on the production environment, and our community of developers is, I would say, rather small. Because of that, sometimes you will have to dive into the source code of the Angular or ask the Angular team how particular things work, which may not be that beneficial, but I think it's okay because SSR is still growing. Another thing in the developer experience that I am personally lacking is the missing DevTools for the transfer state. I would seriously love to see the content that is transferred from the server side to the client side and then reused in the request, because as of today, I don't have such opportunity and a tool that would allow me to do this. Next, we also have a thing that is changing right now. For many years since introduction of the hydration in the Angular SSR, which was a seriously breaking yet very performant change, our system got kind of blocked. Not every library and not every feature support the hydration, and because of that, we were lacking support, for example, for the Angular localized library, which has not supported hydration. We only, as I mentioned previously, received the support in the version 19. Then Angular material was also kind of issue because some of the components were also not supporting hydration until the version 18. And lastly, we had no official way to write applications that uses SSR in the zoneless mode until the version 19, which is the newest version of Angular. All of that showcases that the Angular SSR is still dynamically growing, and we can see that many of the things, even though they are working on them over the last couple of years, are still in a need and are still developing. So with that in mind, let's go into another section where we will discuss a very important thing in case of the SSR, which is of course writing correct HTML. Just because SSR compares and when it hydrates the content, it compares the content from the server side with the one that is on the client side. So we have to use the correct HTML code. For example, we have to use the t-head and t-body tags within the table. We cannot nest forms and anchor tags inside of one another. and we are not able to create a content on the SSR that renders based on the device viewport because we simply don't have that information. And in case we will try to break any of these rules, Angular will simply remind us that we have a DOM mismatch, something that our server-side content was rendered differently than the one that was rendered on the client side. But there are also cases where where we've written our code perfectly and it had no errors, yet services like Cloudflare, for example, or other proxies and middlewares, or even browser extensions could modify our HTML response. As you can imagine, the issues of this issue are there are many issues that can cause this issue, and debugging this DOM mismatch itself can take a long hours. As you can see here in this GitHub issue, some random folk, it took around 10 hours to fix this particular problem, which I am feeling because I've dealt with it many times. The good thing is that Angular will in the future improve the diagnostic of this error, so we'll be able to fix it much quicker. And when it comes to the fixing this particular DOM mismatch error, as I mentioned, it's the best for us that we write our correct HTML code. But as you may know, sometimes it is not possible, and we will have to write our code, for example, depending on the viewport, or we are just using an external library. In such cases, we can take advantage of the ngSkipHydration attribute and skip the hydration for this given component, which, as you may know, sometimes is needed. For example, just because we have to use that shared library in our project, which renders the content based on the viewport, but we don't have the time to refactor this particular piece of code. Okay, moving on to the next section, and here we will discuss a very important thing in case of the SSR is, in my opinion, the external libraries. Picking an external library for a standard project that does not have SSR can be difficult. And in cases of the SSR, it's even more difficult and I would say even cumbersome. The libraries for the SSR have two major things that make them ideal or just don't use them. First of these things is DOM manipulation or viewport-based rendering. Any library that you use must not violate the correct HTML rule, which we discussed earlier, and it is really important. Another thing, which is even more important, at least in my opinion, is the loading performance and bundle size of such library, because you should pick only the lightweight libraries for your project. By comparing these two potential arguments why to choose or why not to choose a particular library, you are often limited. You're often finding that your options are limited. As a result of that, you have two options. Either you will write something from scratch or utilize the package on the NPM, which in the long term may not be beneficial. Just because you wanted to write code, some of the code quickly can bring you a long-term issues, especially in case of the SSR, which in my opinion requires the hardest performance optimizations in any Angular applications that are on the market. So I would rather say that you should think at least twice when choosing an external library, because this is that important, and here you may have not in the future the time to refactor this library, or simply refactoring it can be almost impossible because this will take so much time. Okay, moving on to the next thing that is related to the SSR, and I think many of you may know it, and it is the SEO. Any Angular application that uses SSR would likely need some search engine optimization. And in case you don't know it yet, you should get familiar with it because, in my opinion, it is the whole point of having SSR in your project. There are many tools that you can utilize to boost the SEO on your website, and just one of them is the title and meta description, which are quite easy to set, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with it. You can do it with the title or the meta service, and yeah, that's it. These services are really simple. Another great thing that you may want to implement in your application that utilizes SSR is, for example, the OG tags. They allow us to create a social media preview in our applications, For example, on platforms like Discord, Facebook, LinkedIn, whenever any of your users will paste the link there. They're also quite easy to implement. All you have to do is to inject the meta service and add the particular tags into the head of your response document. Sometimes in the OG tags, we can even define the details for example, on the user page for our user and say that it has this first name, this last name, this gender, and overall, we can even set its nickname. But for such things and including extra information for the search engines, there is even a better tool, and it's called the rich results. In case of the SSR, we can take advantage of standards like JSON-LD, RDF, and microdata to implement rich previews of our content that is present on the page and the search engines. So, for example, on the left side, you can see pad thai there that showed up when we typed in the Google pad thai recipe. The good thing about the JSON-LD is that the Google instantly knows that our recipe is named pad thai. It takes 30 minutes to prepare and it consists of particular ingredients, which in my opinion, without having JSON-LD on your particular site, getting such information would almost be impossible, at least in the era before the AI came. So about the implementation of the JSON-LD, it is quite simple. All you have to do is to create a script tag and in the SSR inject it into your document head. That is pretty much it. All you have to do is also to insert the type and stringify the content of the JSON-LD schema, which you can find in the JSON-LD documentation. Summarizing the search engine optimization, there are also a few more things that you can implement on your website. These are the creation of the robots.txt file, which informs where the Google crawlers and overall crawlers can enter and where they cannot. So for example, you can tell them that they should not visit the 404 page and the cart page. Another great thing is having a sitemap.xml file, especially in case of the big websites, where we want to make sure that every particular page in our application gets crawled and will be indexed in Google. Besides that, there are also obvious things like setting appropriate keywords in our particular pages and writing semantic HTML along semantic attributes, because it brings the most value to the Google that you give it the content that is present on your website in an easily understandable for its way. Okay, that is pretty much it for the SEO, and I think there are even more things that you can do. Now we'll move on to some random issues that you can bump into when working on the SSR. And we'll start with the Angular animations package. Just because of the bundle reasons, you will likely need to provide it asynchronously with the provide animations async package. But there comes an issue. Your animations on the site won't be executed until this package fully loads and executes, which obviously may take quite a lot of time. So for example, in case you have fading animation that comes from the opacity 0 to opacity 100, it may not be the best solution because your content will be invisible unless this package loads. And believe me, on the 3G internet, it can take quite a lot of time. So if I were you, I would seriously use the CSS for the animations on your site because it's much more performant and easier to implement. Okay, another complex thing in case of the SSR is definitely the authentication. It gets really complex in case of the SSR because we have to read the request object and return the particular content based on this particular request. Overall, we get a lot of the conditional logic in our application, and we may also want to develop a custom transfer state solution because by default, Angular SSR won't cache the request with the authorization and proxy authorization headers. But in my opinion, the greatest con of the SSR is its cost. SSR applications compared to the client-side applications can be seriously costly just because they tend to have a lot of resources required in order for them to be performant. Firstly, we need a good runtime server We would also likely need some in-memory database like Redis so we can cache the requests and don't render them over and over again. And things that we must not forget about is the performance of our site, so we would likely need CDN service like Cloudflare and of course optimization service for the images, for example ImageX. So be sure to implement the SSR in applications that only actually need it, so you don't end up paying a bag of money just for applications that actually have not needed the SSR in the first place. In the next step, we'll have the transfer state issues, and I would say in case of the SSR, this may be problematic. In case you send more and more requests, your transfer state overall will grow, and sometimes it may happen that you get the duplicated content in your HTML code. So for example, let's say that you have a JSON-LD endpoint, and it gets transferred to the client side, even though it shouldn't be. Just because we've inserted it into the script tag like we've seen previously, and we don't want to duplicate this request in our response. What can we do about it? The solution is quite simple. All we have to do is to implement filtering for our transfer state. We can do it as following. Firstly, we create HTTP context token and name it accordingly. I like the name Ignore Hydration Cache. Then we implement the filtering for the transfer state in the provide client hydration. And lastly, all we have to do in this case is to ignore the hydration cache for the particular request. It is as simple as that, but remember to use it only on the requests that are actually duplicating the content. But there is also another bigger con when it comes to the transfer cache and biggest issue overall, I would say. Sometimes it may happen that your application is not becoming stable within the 10 seconds, as you can see below. And the drawback of that is that your request will be reused from the transfer cache unless your application will become stable. As a con of that and visual bug will be that your requests are not actually refreshing the data in your application, which in my opinion is a really bad scenario. The cause of it is likely some macro task that blocks the stabilization of your application, and you should be careful of it. And in my opinion, it is seriously worth to implement an end-to-end test, especially if you're working in a big team. As an example end-to-end test, it's, I would say, quite simple. All you have to do is to provide protractor testing utilities, and then in the test itself, you must go through each individual crucial page in your application and execute this getTime until apps is stable method, which we'll discover in the next slide. And finally, what you have to do is simply to check whether your application becomes stable within given amount of time. So when it comes for the implementation of this particular getTime until app is stable function, it looks like this. Firstly, we wait until the testabilities are available in our browser, and in case they are not available, we return the -1. In case they are available, we start the timer, and when the testabilities will say that our application becomes stable, we return the total time for our application to become stable. Believe me or not, but this test is seriously essential just because some of your teammates may be doing optimizations, even in not your application in case you're working in monorepo. And as a result of that, they may, even without their knowledge, break the transfer cache in your application, which have some tragic consequences. Okay, this is pretty much it when it comes for the transfer cache, and the stabilization issue is, I would say, it's seriously common. Last thing that I would like to discuss today is the biggest con of the SSR, or I would say most complex thing in the SSR, just because it is the performance of the SSR applications. You must lazy load as much code as you need because you want to have a pretty good scores in your application and you want your users to load your application really quickly. You must check your bundle size every now and then and see if your application is actually fast. Besides that, you also need to take care of the initial load and make sure that it is fast. And as I mentioned earlier, we have to optimize our images, load the fonts lazily, Every now and then, we should also be able to check our HTML and CSS size, and if possible, shorten it so it's not as long. And most important thing, let's use a compression algorithm on our servers. The best choice as of right now is the Broadly, which is completely insane when it comes for the compression ratio that we get. Okay, this is pretty much it, and I would like to finish this presentation with one thought in mind. Angular SSR may not be the best framework as of right now for implementing SSR, but it is definitely growing. And with the incremental hydration coming to the Angular, I think that we are in the better spot than ever to make this feature seriously useful and work with other and face other frameworks like, for example, Nest, in terms of the optimization of our applications. In my opinion, SSR in Angular is worth trying, and in the project that I'm working at, we are seriously happy that we've chosen Angular 2 years ago, where nobody of us know the future of the Angular SSR. Last thing that I would like to show you today is the downloads of the Angular SSR and ng Universal that you can see in this rose line, and they're growing rapidly. Angular SSR is becoming much more popular nowadays than it used to be before, and I'm seriously proud of this whole thing, because back then the Angular SSR was seriously not that popular, and they were little devs that could work with it. So yeah, that's it for my presentation, and now I will be taking up questions.
Okay, thank you, David, for a great presentation with a lot of useful tips. So as you mentioned, now let's dive into the Q&A session. So if you haven't asked your questions yet, be sure to do this now. And let me start with the first question. I believe we already touched it a little bit, but it's like a frequently asked question. So maybe let's try to sum it up again. So it's from Sohail Ansari: when to use and don't use SSR.
So in my opinion, SSR is only useful in case you need search engine optimization. This is the primary case when you need to use SSR in your project, and without it, I personally would not use it. SSR can also boost up your initial loading of the application. That means the users will see your screen of the application faster, but in my opinion, it is most beneficial, as I said, when the customers don't know your project and they're entering it from the Google. So in that case, you want to make this application discoverable in Google and make it so fast that the user won't bounce out of your application and page just because it's loading slowly.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have another one. How does SSR work with defer at the template?
That's a very good question. And until introduction of the incremental hydration, SSR have not worked with the defer template, and that was a big con of the defer. Back then, the defer would just not render the content, and the SSR would return the HTML without the defer content. And now, since the introduction of the incremental hydration, we'll get the content rendered in the defer, so that's definitely a big improvement in case of the defer. So to sum up, in case of the use of the defer alone, the Angular SSR would not return the content inside of the defer template. And in case you are using defer along with the incremental hydration, Angular will return the content inside of the template and will hydrate it whenever the trigger that is set on the incremental hydration is met.
Okay, that's a great response. And let's get to another one from Dmitry Dreko. How do you usually measure performance for SSR apps?
That's a really good question, and that often depends on the performance that you want to get. In my opinion, there are two types of the performance. First one of them is the runtime performance, which in my opinion is good in case of the SSR, but we are more caring about the performance of the initial loading. So for example, when we want to measure the initial loading performance, we can take advantage of tools such as Lighthouse and some of the internet services that actually use this lighthouse under the hood to check with our routine whenever we make appear that our application is actually running fast. When it comes for the checking the bundle size alone, we have tools like Webpack Bundle Size Analyzer and Source Map Explorer that allow us to see how our application is doing in terms of the bundle size and what we can potentially eliminate from our initial load in cases of the JavaScript. I'm also often using the Control U tool that allows me to check the code that was sent in case of the SSR response, because in my opinion, it's really important to check it manually and see if it actually contains things that are not needed initially. So we can decrease the initial size of the response that SSR returns as much as possible.
Okay, so let's get to the next one. We have a couple of them, so let me pick one. Maybe that's the one from Gulam Asgar. Can you SSR an app using only standalone components?
Yes, you can, and I would say that is the way to do an SSR application in 2025.
Okay, so that's great. I believe we have two more questions. So maybe, David, you can consider answering them asynchronously in the chat. That would be great because we need to move on.
Okay, I will do.
Yep. Thank you for that. And thank you for being with us today. That was a great pleasure. And I hope to see you in the future events. Take care and bye.